You're watching Current Affairs on CNBC Life.
Welcome to this special CNBC report on Myanmar. One of the world's most isolated nations is finally opening up. After 50 years of oppressive military rule, it's on the cusp of a political transformation. And it's taking measured but meaningful steps to liberalize its state-controlled economy. Sanctions are being lifted in return, and small parts of this country are being swept up in a gold rush. Over the next 30 minutes, government leaders, major foreign investors, and local entrepreneurs will tell you about their plans for Asia's last frontier. I'm Kaori Enjoji in Yangon, and you're watching Myanmar Calling.
Yangon, Myanmar's largest city, is crumbling. Memories of its colonial grandeur decaying after decades of conflict and neglect. After independence in 1948, the myriad ethnic groups fought for control and were suppressed by a military junta in the longest ongoing war in the world, leaving its citizens some of the poorest in the world. Since the country's first general election in 2010, the nominally civilian government led by President Thein Sein has released some political prisoners. Ceasefires have been signed. The leader of Myanmar's democracy movement, Aung San Suu Kyi, now an elected member of parliament, traveled abroad for the first time in 24 years.
We want investment to mean, quite simply, jobs, as many jobs as possible.
From the European Union to the United States, governments have rewarded Myanmar for its political reforms by lifting sanctions. And now, the fate of its 62 million people rests on how the country decides to embark on economic reforms.
This is a period where they're finally, in a sense, coming to terms with what it is to be a nation.
There's little basic infrastructure like electricity and plumbing, let alone labor laws and foreign investment rules. Yet every day in Yangon, a who's who of international investors are trying to tap into what the IMF calls a historic opportunity. The changes have already minted a handful of tycoons, like this sole private port operator at the mouth of the Yangon River. Coco, as he likes to call himself, spent nearly 2 decades of his youth at sea. As a Burmese back then, it was the only way to see the world. That experience and political connections gave him a license to open his port in 1993. Privatization will be inevitable if Myanmar wants to attract long-term capital, but most sectors are now controlled by the state.
Another 3 years' time, 5 years' times. So that will be export sector also will grow, and even transport sector also grow. So the business cannot be alone. So all community and the whole globalized coming, they share the ideas, investment, and everything have to grow, and the people have more creative job and happy for the world. I confident this country must grow.
He's betting imports will surge as sanctions are lifted, making plans to double his port to 250 acres within 4 years. Coco's dock is full of containers importing machinery, raw materials, and electronic components, mostly from China and Korea. Rice and crops are about the only exports. Myanmar's low cost of labor, though, is likely to be a magnet for manufacturers, whose factories in turn could drive exports in the future. A factory worker in Yangon earns about $68 a month, a quarter of wages in Bangkok and half the cost of similar labor in Ho Chi Minh. While many other Asian countries struggle with an aging population, Myanmar's is relatively young. Like many developing countries, the primary sector is still Myanmar's biggest private employer. Due to years of isolation with the rest of the world, China has been its largest trading partner. While Chinese companies dominate sectors like precious stones, timber, and coal, Myanmar is also rich in other resources such as natural gas and tungsten. It's the prize Myanmar may offer to those who give help now, building roads and basic infrastructure.
We have no capital, no technology, so we need investment. We welcome the whole country, especially ASEAN country, and Japan, China, America, Europe. So all the investor we treat as the level playing field, not favor to the specific country.
Myanmar's geography has been both a blessing and a curse. Sandwiched between the powerhouses of India and China, refugees, goods, heroin, and weapons have crossed its long borders with 5 countries. 640 kilometers of coastline look towards the Indian Ocean. The wounds of war that ravaged the country since independence are visible everywhere. A quarter of its population lives in poverty without access to education or health care. By 2015, when national elections are next scheduled, the government has pledged it will reduce poverty to 16%. Officials say they know their own legitimacy is at stake if they fail to address such bread-and-butter issues.
Some businessmen and politicians are worried that the reforms we've seen in Myanmar over the last year in particular may be reversed. Is that concern warranted?
It is impossible. It is impossible. Because the global community, also regional community, welcome our reform. Also our people, for our people, we need reform. People desire is the reform, change. That's why the government who elected by the people must do. If not, they are going down.
Flickers of discontent cloak Yangon, especially at night, when one of a dozen power outages that occur every day blacken the alleys. Many whisper frustration over inflation and a volatile currency. They fear the bubble fueling some parts of the city will only increase their hardship. Travelers say hotel prices have tripled in the last year. Local speculators boast about flipping a piece of property for double the price in just 3 days. Some used cars, mostly from Japan, cost 6 times more than they did a year ago. It's precisely this boom, however, that's driving developers to Myanmar. This is Tilawa, just south of the Yangon River, and where Singapore-based Yoma Strategic Holding is building 9,000 apartments. Priced between $60,000 to $120,000 US, investors are betting on yields of 30%. That's average for a frontier market. A lot depends on whether the area really will be designated a special economic zone.
Maybe a Shenzhen type development where people from overseas will be encouraged to come in, invest in the country. There will be tax breaks, there will be infrastructure put in, and I think you might see heavy industry all the way through to light industry, depending on what the sort of breaks are given for what sort of industries. I think that's all very much work in progress.
In addition to Tilawa, which is closest to Yangon, 2 other potential special economic zones are likely to be central to Myanmar's economic development. Dawei to the south is a joint project with Thailand, complete with a deep sea port with future road and rail access to Thailand. Chao Phu in the north is the center of China's oil and natural gas pipelines.
Myanmar, like Vietnam before, will have that honeymoon period, which is we're experiencing now. The first wave of investors, it's not the ones that actually make money usually. It's maybe the investors that come after, when already you have established the legal and business environment. People learn from their original mistakes.
When Parliament reconvenes in July, tax breaks and other incentives to encourage an inflow of money are likely to top the agenda.
A whole new set of rules to encourage investment will have to be made from scratch, and they'll all need to be rubber-stamped here in the capital of Naypyidaw. 7 years ago, this city was crowned the new center of government, and back then, this was all just shrubland. Next, we'll take you inside Naypyidaw, where few cameras until now have been able to freely film, when Myanmar Calling returns.
You're watching a CNBC special on CNBC Life.
Amata Corporation Public Company Limited, Thailand's leading industrial city, is expanding its presence internationally along the important ASEAN Southwest Economic Corridor that runs from southern Vietnam to Thailand and ending in Myanmar. Amata envisions the next generation of all their estates moving towards an innovation city concept consisting of 3 main layers: Smart City, Eco City, and Learning City, all in one community. Amata, perfect smart city developer.
Think of air, think of soil, think of water, think of life. Think of people, think of rice fields, think of laughter. Think of opinions, think of sustainable energy. Think 10 years from now, think 100 years from now. We do not only think of electricity generation, we think of you. EGAT, your reliable energy partner in Thailand.
Welcome back to Myanmar Calling. I'm in Naypyidaw, some 300 kilometers north of Yangon. The new government has been in office for just over a year, and it has surprised the world with a number of reforms. Since the pro-democracy leader Aung San Suu Kyi's party won in landslide victory in elections in April, flurry of dignitaries have descended on the capital here in Naypyidaw. From U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to British Prime Minister David Cameron, governments around the world want to see how serious Myanmar is about reform. And now, the private sector is quickly following in their footsteps.
There's only one road that leads to the capital, Naypyidaw. The countryside stretches for hours. When the farms are suddenly replaced by monuments, you know you have arrived. It's arid. Massive government ministries, homes of officials color-coded by roofs, a replica of the famous Shetagon Pagoda, all rise from the earth like alien landings in a desert. It took the military leaders years to build this fortress. At what cost, no one knows for certain. Physically and figuratively, Naypyidaw is a guarded place. A 16-lane road protects the parliament. Almost everywhere you look, the silence is stifling. But it's the place to do deals. It's official. Myanmar will have a stock exchange by 2015, and it needs help from both presidents of the Tokyo Stock Exchange and Daiwa Institute of Research. 16 years ago, Daiwa set up a joint venture in Yangon in the hope that one day this day would come.
It took a long time. It was up in the air for ages. The biggest reason was sanctions. Building a capital market is a national endeavor. There was a lot of dealing beneath the surface. We were never at peace.
But the real work is only just beginning.
We are interested in doing business with all nations, including Japan. That's why we are taking the necessary steps so that we can start contributing to the global economy.
Those include a foreign direct investment law, which he says will be passed soon. Without it, and a myriad other basic rules ranging from taxation to IT, it's still hard to visualize what Myanmar's stock market will look like in 3 years. 2 exchanges, one in Yangon and another in Mandalay, are likely to be in the making. Consultants say about 30 local companies may be ready to list. In a nation rife with black markets, some question if oversight will really be possible in Myanmar. Others say that in its purest form, the capital market itself can act as a regulator.
I think the stock exchange has 2 missions. One is naturally as an in corporations. We have to reward to the shareholders. But much more important mission is we have a lot of social work. We have to work for the sake of the society to keep the high efficient market, to provide the high quality risk capital. I really hate the greedy money chaser type of a business, particularly as an exchange. So if we could contribute something for this state for the future, That is my pleasure.
Japan and Myanmar have had a long and at times difficult history. Japan occupied Burma between 1942 and 1945 during World War II until it lost to Allied forces. In the 50s, the two nations signed a reparations agreement, a model for Japan's ODA program with other Asian countries in the decades that followed. In April, Japan became the first developed nation to forgive Myanmar of its debt, estimated at $11 billion. The partial waiver cleared the way for Tokyo to renew lending, part and parcel of future investment by the private sector. Marubeni, Japan's major trading house, is banking on such public-private investments. Their new office in Naypyidaw is a one-man shop run by Akihito Asayama. Armed with stints in Syria, Jordan, and Pakistan, he says the only way to get real information is to hobnob with power.
At
one point, 25% of the electricity generated in Myanmar was supplied from generators that our company, Marubeni, built. So electricity, railways, plants, water supply, and sewage will be involved in all that. We'll be developing the Telawa Special Economic Zone. I'm looking at a number of commodity deals.
Those plans need skilled labor, which many say is inadequate.
This country has a massive opportunity, but that opportunity needs to be captured. And to be able to do that, you need to have the human capital element in place. And it takes time.
His private equity firm has just launched a $25 million Myanmar Human Capital Fund, banking on years of experience in similar frontier markets like Mongolia. Even in Yangon, executives say local talent is limited because over the years, many have left for better jobs overseas. In the villages, it's even scarcer. Tidaw is among the 70% of people in Myanmar who the Asian Development Bank says have no access to electricity. Her husband died working in Malaysia, leaving her to toil the land and barter for food to feed herself and her 6-year-old son. The UN says that Myanmar receives less humanitarian aid per capita than almost any other poor country.
You can have a division in society where you have the masses, which are 70% of the population, are rural. 70%. If they start seeing that it's only in the cities, you're going to have a real strong social issue, a strong social problem. And that, as we know from the history of China, can go into terrible directions.
In the city, inside this bank on the corner of Yangon's Wall Street, potential already lurks. Here and everywhere, cash is king. Until April, when the country started a managed float of its currency, 6 Myanmar kyats were officially worth $1 US, a peg to the IMF's special drawing rights put in place in 1977. The unofficial rate, used every day, was more like 800 kyats. Since the float, the central bank has set a reference point of 818 kyats to the dollar, roughly sinking the official rate to the black market. It's a major milestone for Myanmar, but the average worker, usually paid in dollars, is taking 2 hits, first on the exchange rate and lately by inflation. Currency reform is an extremely sensitive topic in Myanmar, but critical if the nation wants to foster trade and investment. A move by the late dictator General Ne Win to cancel some banknote denominations helped to spark a violent pro-democracy movement in 1988.
I think near term, what is needed is to get the financial system, the financial sector, ready for investments. Currently, in terms of lending ability, the banking system is still very restricted, right? So, there could be potential issues trying to get working capital, trying to get funding.
Sanctions have locked out Myanmar from global banking for years. But recent changes in the financial sector have been revolutionary, like this brand new ATM at Kamboza Bank. A national ATM network is likely to be rolled out within weeks, linking the country's 13 private banks to a new debit card network for the first time. Once sanctions are fully lifted, banks will be able to send money abroad, paving the way for foreign financial institutions like banks and credit card companies to reopen for business in Myanmar. Partnerships are quickly being signed in anticipation of these dramatic changes, like the one Kamboza inked in May with Sumitomo Mitsui Banking.
Everyday life in Myanmar is colored with contrast. While international investors jet set into town, there are some reports that say a quarter of the population lives under the poverty line. Next on Myanmar Calling, a look at half a century of conflict that has torn apart this country and its recent hope to reconnect with the world. Stay tuned.
Korean Free Economic Zones. Invest in Korea now, where business blossoms. Korean Free Economic Zones.
Welcome back to Myanmar Calling. This is Bojose, a market the British built back in 1926 and renamed after General Aung San, father to Suu Kyi and modern-day Burma. Since restrictions were loosened dramatically over the last year, people talk pretty freely about who they want to be president after national elections in 2015. Myanmar will be hosting the Southeast Asian Games next year and is eager to chair ASEAN in 2014. We talk about the tightrope between politics and economics.
Hordes of foreigners hunting for riches are nothing new to Myanmar. The country has a long history of invasions of one kind or another, from the Chinese and Siamese several centuries ago to the British, who moved in as colonial rulers in the 19th century. They were pushed out when Japan occupied Burma during the Second World War. The country became independent in 1948. But the following decades were marked by insurgencies, coups, and brutal ethnic conflicts, as well as little economic development. In 1988, the military took control of Burma to put down anti-government protests. Thousands were killed. A year later, the ruling generals renamed Burma as Myanmar. Elections were held in 1990, and Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy won with an overwhelming majority. But they would never take power. The military overturned the results and put Suu Kyi under house arrest. In 1991, she won the Nobel Peace Prize, but remained in custody for most of the following 2 decades. Her country would come under increasing international scrutiny and sanctions for its treatment of Suu Kyi and severe repression of human rights. In 2012, now free, Suu Kyi was permitted to run with other members of her party. The by-elections were heralded as a significant step towards democracy, a move paralleled by a rapid series of economic reforms. After her election victory, Suu Kyi made her first trip abroad in 24 years, journeying to Thailand. She cautioned those who see golden opportunities in Myanmar.
We have to try to eradicate corruption and inequality as we proceed towards greater investment.
She also visited some of the thousands of refugees from her country who have poured across the border into Thailand, and CNBC went along. Then she traveled to Europe and finally received her Nobel Peace Prize, using the occasion to speak out against recent ethnic violence in Myanmar.
Fires of suffering and strife are raging around the world. In my own country, hostilities have not yet ceased in the far north. To the west, communal violence resulting in arson and murder were taking place just several days before I started out on the journey that has brought me here today.
The government has declared a state of emergency in the West after horrific scenes of violence between Buddhists and Rohingya Muslims, an ethnic minority that human rights groups call the most persecuted people in the world. The government does not consider the Rohingya citizens, and so they are unable to work, own property, or marry. The latest trouble began when a Buddhist girl was raped and killed in May. Rohingya men were blamed, and enraged Buddhists looked for vengeance. Hundreds of people may have been killed, and tens of thousands displaced. Human Rights Watch is worried that the state of emergency could actually inflame the situation.
The track record of the Burmese army in the Arakan state is really abusive. And so, but now currently, we are really worried that the army is in charge of the state and the international observers are leaving the state.
Beyond the current unrest, the organization worries that the rush to invest in Myanmar could open the door to even further abuses.
Large-scale constructions can cause eviction of indigenous people, for example. But in Burma, on top of that, those projects can involve army presence, and then the army can cause abuses such as forced labor or even rapes or killings. So all the private companies needs to be super careful so that they will not be complicit to grave human rights abuses which can happen in Burma.
So those on the hunt for opportunities have much to consider. The dizzying pace of change, the uncertainty over whether reforms will continue, questions of political and social stability, the balance between profit and principle.
The energy and enthusiasm surrounding Myanmar are undeniable. As one of the least developed nations in the world, it's difficult to make any meaningful comparison to the explosive growth we've seen in other parts of Asia. The pragmatists will say it might take a decade or even longer. And the romantics will say that at the turn of the century, this country was the wealthiest in Southeast Asia. But both say that opening up the country to new ideas, new people, and new capital may be the only option Myanmar has left to pulling itself out of poverty. I'm Kaori Enjoji. Thank you for watching.
Because I'm naughty, naughty. Hey, I'm Mr. Simple. Because I'm naughty, naughty. Mr. Simple.
Worldwide exchange, global news, market agenda.
A volatile session for stocks around the globe. We talk to world leaders and key newsmakers.
There needs to be constructive dialogue between regulators and banks.
You can't actually see me in this wall because we've still got so much red going on.
Going